Hello friends, this video on sexual reproduction in flowering plants part 10 is brought to you by examfear.com. No more fear from exam. So now we have understood how male gametes are formed and how female gametes are formed, and I am sure that there is no confusion. So male gametes, where are they formed? They are formed inside the anthers, inside the pollen sacs, that is the microsporangium. Female gametes, they are formed in the embryo sac. Inside the embryo sac are located the female gametes, which are nothing but the egg cell and the polar nuclei. So now we have to understand, what we have to understand is how these gametes meet, because neither the male gamete is motile nor the female gamete is motile. So how will they meet? So for that purpose of gamete transfer, pollination serves the most important thing. So pollination helps the male and the female gametes to meet. So why pollination? So as I just said, that the main objective here is we want to understand the process of sexual reproduction, and this process will be able to take place only when there is fusion between the male gamete and the female gamete, and for that fusion to take place, both the gametes has to meet. So how will they meet? Because they are not motile, they cannot move on their own. So pollination fills that gap. So what does pollination do? Let us suppose these are the two plants, right? So let us suppose there are pollen grains which are produced in this plant in their male gametes. Let us suppose here pollen grains are produced. So you want to carry these pollen grains to this plant's flower where the female gametes are being produced. So who will help you in carrying that? So that is the purpose. That is what pollination does. It is nothing but the transfer of the pollen grains from anther to stigma. Now it can be on the same plant, it can be on different plant. So the pollen grain, as I said, when you talk about the male gamete, so which is the male gamete? Male gamete is located in the pollen grain. What about the female gamete? Female gamete is the egg cell or the polar nuclei, whatever. So these pollen grains are in the anther. And where are the egg cells? They are in the embryo sac. And where is the embryo sac? It is inside the ovule, and the ovule is inside the ovary. So basically the female gamete is inside the ovary somewhere here. This is where the female gamete is, and the male gamete is somewhere here. So how do I transfer the male gamete from here to here? So pollination does the same. It transfers the male gametes from anther to stigma. So stigma is this place. So once it reaches stigma, it can actually reach the ovule. So pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. Now pollination can be of two categories, that is self-pollination and cross-pollination. So there are two categories of pollination that take place. One is self-pollination and the other one is cross-pollination. So self-pollination is when the pollen grains are transferred from anther to stigma of the same flower or of the same plant. That is called self-pollination. Cross-pollination would mean that the pollen grain is transferred from anther of one plant to the stigma of another plant altogether. So that is cross-pollination. So how does this transfer take place? So this transfer, because they cannot move on their own, so there has to be something which carries them. So this takes place with the help of pollinating agents. And what are those pollinating agents? They can be anything, like an insect which can actually carry, for example, the bee which sits on the flower. They can carry the pollen grain from one flower to another. Wind, water, birds, they all act as pollinating agents. So let us look at the different types of pollination. Now, pollination is divided into three types, that is based on the source of pollen, so from where the pollen is received. So there are three types, that is autogamy, Geitonogamy and Xenogamy. So these are the three types of pollination. So let us try to understand each of them. So let us begin with autogamy. Auto. What is the meaning of auto? Auto means something which is self, related to self. So transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of the same flower. So on the same flower, you have the anther, you have the stigma, and the pollen grains gets transferred within the same flower. So let us suppose if this is the flower, here only you have the anthers, here only you have the stigma. So the pollen grains are just getting transferred within the same flower. So that is called autogamy. Auto means own or self. So now the question is, how will autogamy happen? I mean, how will it get transferred within the same flower? Now, if anther and stigma are exposed, then it is not possible for the male gametes to get transferred from anther to stigma, right? Now, one of possibility is that if the anthers and the stigma are extremely close to each other, in that case, they can by itself get transferred. So that is one option. But in order that the anther and the stigma are extremely close, what has to be there? The flower should be closed. Because if the flower is open and wide enough, in that case the anthers and stigma will be quite far from each other. For example, if you have a big flower like this, so what happens if this is your anther, this is where you have your stigma. So the distance is considerably larger. But if you have a closed flower, something like this, a flower, so if you have your stigma here, this is where you have the anther. So they are extremely close. So in case of a closed flower, it is easier. So this autogamy is seen in plants which produce chasmogamous and clistogamous flowers. Now what is chasmogamous and clistogamous? Let us quickly look. So chasmogamous flowers are those which have exposed anther and stigma. That means the flower is wide open, and that is why the anther and stigma both are exposed and both are considerably far away from each other. So in chasmogamous flowers, autogamy is not possible because the pollen grains cannot jump from the anther to stigma over a considerable distance. Whereas in case of clistogamous flowers, they have closed flowers. So when the flower is closed, the anther and stigma lie very close to each other. And when they are so close, in that case, autogamy becomes possible. So this autogamy is seen in clistogamous flowers. Now there are certain plants which bear both autogamous and both chasmogamous and clistogamous flowers. Now let me give you some examples of plants where you get this kind of flowers. For example, viola is one example, polygola is another example. So in viola, you can actually see violet colored flowers. Polygola is also known as the snake root species. So some of these species, they produce chasmogamous flowers with well-developed petals pollinated by insects, whereas some other produce self-pollinated clistogamous flowers that do not open. So in case of chasmogamous flowers, autogamy is difficult or self-pollination is difficult. So in that case, you need the pollinating agents to carry them from one flower to another. So in case of clistogamous flowers, if you talk about the clistogamous, where they are very close to each other, so in this case, there is no chance of cross-pollination. Why? Because the flower will never open at all. Because for cross-pollination, what has to be done? The pollen grains need to be carried from the anther of that flower to the stigma of another flower of another plant. So for that, the anther has to be exposed. But in case of clistogamous flowers, they are always closed. So their anthers will never be exposed to the pollinating agents. And that is why cross-pollination is never possible with clistogamous flowers. Now, if you talk about the chasmogamous flowers, of course, cross-pollination is very well possible because the flowers are wide open, anther and stigma are exposed, but the chances of self-pollination is very less. So here, less chance, we cannot say there is no chance, but we would say less chance of self-pollination, because the anther and stigma are considerably far away from each other. So this was about autogamy. So as I said, examples are viola and polygola. So let us look at the next type of pollination, that is Geitonogamy. So what does it do? Here the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of another flower of the same plant. So you are still on the same plant, but in autogamy, if the transfer was happening within one flower, but here the transfer is happening from one flower to another. So it is like a little more distance now. So you can say, now some people say that when it is from one flower to another flower, it should be like cross pollination. But since it is of the same plant, so it is same self pollination as well. So we can say that functionally it is from one flower to another flower. So functionally it is like a cross pollination. But if you talk about genetically since it is within the same plant, so the gene is still the same. So genetically it is self-pollination. So the Geitonogamy is like midway between self-pollination and cross-pollination. Functionally it is cross-pollination because it is actually carrying the anther from one flower to another. But genetically, since it is within the same plant, so the genes are the same, therefore genetically it is self-pollination. So it is functionally cross-pollination but genetically self-pollination. So this is very important. Now the last type of pollination, that is xenogamy. So what happens in xenogamy? This is completely cross-pollination. So what happens here is the pollen grains are transferred from anther to stigma of a different plant. So now when you are going to a different plant, it is functionally cross-pollination because you are actually carrying it from one plant to another. It is genetically also cross-pollination because the two different plants will have two different genes. So genetically also it will be cross-pollination. And by this method, you can actually produce plants of different varieties or plants of desired qualities by making combinations between them. So genetically as well as functionally cross-pollination. So it is something like this. Let us suppose you have to carry the pollen grain from this plant to this plant. So this plant will have certain traits which is very specific to this. Similarly, this plant will have certain traits very specific to this. But when cross-pollination occurs, the product or the flower which will be produced might have some characters similar to this flower and some characters similar to this flower. So new varieties can be produced by this type of cross-pollination. Thank you. Please visit www.examfear.com to watch more videos, attempt free online test, get free study material, find tutors and mentors. Thank you once again.